College football nerds here talking top 10, and it was absolutely bonkers this weekend. One of the best weekends in college football that we've had in a long time, but a lot of the favored teams won close, a lot of the higher ranking teams. So there may be not that much shakeup, but a lot of interesting talking points, which really the 10 that we give you is just a doorway to talk football with y'all and for me to talk football with Josh. So Josh, why don't you give me your top 10 real quick, and I'll give you mine.
Yeah, so my top 10, we'll start at the top, go to the bottom, and I'm going to go through them pretty quick, and then we'll just kind of discuss from there. I have Texas number 1, Oregon number 2, Ohio State number 3, Georgia number 4, Alabama number 5, Clemson number 6, Miami number 7, Penn State number 8, Tennessee number 9, BYU number 10, and one thing I'll say, Daniel, is once you get past around 4 to 6, you could throw a lot of teams in a hat, and I can understand the argument of why some teams should be 10 spots higher than we have them ranked.
And honestly, I think outside of what we've seen so far from Texas, anything 4 to 20, those higher ranked teams could lose on any given day. Mine go like this. Number 1, Texas. Number 2, Oregon. Number 3, Ohio State. Number 4, Georgia. Number 5, Alabama. Number 6, Clemson. We have the same top 6. I differ with you slightly with Penn State at number 7, Miami number 8, Iowa State at number 9, and BYU at number 10. Josh, I want to start in the middle. I want to start with Clemson. There's a lot of other action that went on this weekend, but both you and I have Clemson ranked pretty high. We've been a little bit higher on them than others. They got, I think, unduly punished from the game with Georgia this year, opening the season. I think people have forgotten about Clemson, and I don't think that's smart because I think that, one, they look like they're going to be in the playoffs. But two, people are very quick to write off Georgia, and they forget what happened in that Clemson game. And they forget that Georgia has a big win under their belt that a lot of these other teams in the top 10 don't really have.
It's interesting because Clemson, we do a computer ranking where we rank every team in the country 1 through 133. You can go to collegefootballnerds.com and check that out. And our ranking is based on purely on-field results, so it's a little wacky or unpredictable because we're not featuring in prior year results. We're not featuring in recruiting rankings. This is just based on what happened this year. If you run our model against your team, everybody else, what would your record be? Just as a thought exercise. Clemson's 31st. Georgia, not that high themselves. In our ranking, they're only 12th as of this second, and sometimes data trickles in a little late, so it could change by the time you look at it. But I do agree with you. I mean, obviously, I've got them pretty high, and it's weird to me, Daniel, that we have them sitting there at 5-1 in the AP at 10th, and we have, for example, LSU at 5-1 and 8th. Clemson's one loss is to Georgia. And yes, they lost badly to Georgia. Alabama lost to Vanderbilt. I don't know why we have kind of collectively wanted to excuse that result. LSU's one loss is to USC. I feel like Clemson would probably beat USC pretty handily. LSU's one good win is that Ole Miss win, which was close, 29-26. I will say Clemson has not played better competition, but they blew out Wake Forest, blew out Stanford, blew out NC State, blew out Upstate. They only kind of sort of blew out Florida State by 16, which is itself sort of deceptive. I mean, they look like a really, really good team, and I'm with you. It's like we decided to bury them after the Georgia game and say, oh, this team's trash, and we're refusing to acknowledge maybe Georgia just played really well in that game. It's a one-off situation against a team that everybody has basically in their top 5 somewhere. I do feel like they've gotten kind of ignored. But again, I can understand the arguments for other teams. It just feels like they're weirdly an afterthought for a lot of people.
So, we saw Oregon beat Ohio State close at home. To me, that is a coin flip game. If they play again, I wasn't about to dump Ohio State any further than third because, again, I think Oregon deserves the reward of beating Ohio State, but I'm not picking Ohio State over Alabama on a neutral field right now. So it's, to me, though, there's still some question. We're going to do a Texas-Georgia preview later. There's still some question about I hear a lot of people saying there's only one elite team. And it's weird because we've only seen Oregon and Ohio State play each other. So we can't glean from that they're not elite because they played each other. We also can't say they're for sure elite because they played each other. But Texas, I think it's hard to put them in that surefire only elite team in the country, meaning they stand out beyond all the rest because they haven't played anybody yet. And again, not their fault. We both got them number one, but there are still question marks there.
And that's the other side of things, I think, is we're still sort of sorting out what teams are right now. From a rankings perspective, I'm not sure how to consider a lot of these wins and losses because, to your point, I don't know really how good Oklahoma really is. And I understand a lot of that's the injury situation for Oklahoma. They're out the top 5 wide receivers. They're out defensive backs. They're not out linemen. They're not the same team that they were supposed to be. They're just not. But that has to factor in your consideration of where to rank teams. And we talked about this a little bit, that when you look at like strength of schedule, remaining strength of schedule, all that stuff for these different teams, the strength of schedule for Texas right now to date nationally is 82nd. And I meant to look this up previously, but I'm fairly certain that's in the top 5 or 10 worst strength of schedules, probably among the 5 worst strength of schedules in the country. The remaining strength of schedule for Texas, to be clear, is 9th. They have a hard schedule, and it is coming. They've got some tough games to play. They're going to have to prove themselves. So if you take that as a slide, if you're a Texas fan, don't. You're going to prove yourself by the end of the year. But to this point, they're in much the same situation Ohio State was, where Ohio State's strength of schedule was, among all Power 5 teams, they were dead last. They had the worst schedule of all those teams up until Saturday. And what we saw is an Ohio State team that looked like an unstoppable juggernaut, and they were apparently stoppable. I still have them top 3 the same as you. We talk about this a lot. I don't just take a loss and immediately dump you 5 spaces and then let you work your way back. I think that's something the AP poll does that's really bad. If you lose to someone I think is the top 2 teams in the country, I don't see any reason why you can't be the 3rd best team in the country. I look at it and say, do I think somebody else would do different? I don't know how you phrased it, but to your point, what you were saying, I wouldn't pick Alabama to beat Ohio State right now. So why would I have them ahead of Oregon just because Oregon happened to lose this past week? I will take a sort of mini victory lap, and then I'll do a mea culpa. 2 things on that game. One, I took a lot of flack, Daniel, at the beginning of the year because I ranked Oregon ahead of Ohio State. And people thought I was nuts because they struggled against Idaho and they struggled against Boise State. And like, why would you ever have it that's, an idiotic take? And look, I owned it and said, that I overreacted or whatnot. But my point at the time was I looked at that team, I looked at how they were playing, I looked at the pieces, and I said there's a lot of talent on that defense. I could see the speed and athleticism. I could see the speed and athleticism on the offense. I thought they were limited offensively and what they can do and how they do it. But the things they do, I could see them doing really well. And their front 7, I kept saying even in the lead up to the Ohio State game, is an SEC-like in a manner that only Ohio State and a couple other teams in the Big Ten are in terms of the combination of size, speed, and power. And that showed up. I wouldn't pick Oregon to win again if they played at Ohio State instead of at Oregon. And when I do these rankings, I kind of view a win as a win. And so if you beat a team once, I assume you would beat them if you played again. And that's kind of how I sort of fix that game in my mind. But, there's not really a whole lot to say whether one team or another is better. I do think from Oregon's perspective, I think it's true that they're really good at what they want to do, but they're limited in other ways. They are kind of small. They generate offense in a very particular spread manner that is either very effective or a little stuttery. Daniel, and I'll say that about both those teams. I was wrong when I said, I thought they were kind of overrated from a skill position perspective at Oregon, and also kind of wasn't. And I know people are going to probably latch onto that as a non-apology, but I said Tez Johnson, I wasn't necessarily that impressed with him. I don't think I was necessarily wrong. He's a really good player. He is not a number 1 impact superstar at a level like Jeremiah Smith relative to the rest of the Big Ten or SEC. Evan Stewart, that came from the SEC, was that guy for them. And so I was wrong in terms of the total depth of that core. But, it was relying on different guys in different ways from Oregon that we hadn't seen before to get them to the level of being able to win that game. And I think a lot of what we saw in that game, too, was 2 teams that have to play a certain type of football. When things work, and I've talked for weeks with Ohio State, I feel like when they get the ball out, they get it in space, they get it to a skill player, they're an unstoppable team offensively. And when they don't, nothing happens. And I'll turn it to you to sort of talk about those few teams. And Daniel, maybe you want to add Alabama into it because I think they have the same problem. There are a lot of these teams right now that I think maybe stylistically, schematically, the way college football is being played, they are either on fire or 3 and out, 4 or 5 play drives, 15 yards. And I think a lot of it is the way teams play defense now. And I think that also has a lot of repercussions into the volatility and unpredictability of a given matchup.
Yeah, I mean, we see it with Alabama. We saw it with Ohio State. Ohio State had, if you're going to have all of your non-scoring drives not go for more than 15 yards, and that's similar to what Alabama does every week, it puts a lot of pressure on your defense. And it also just it's a tough way to live. Now, I think Ohio State is a lot better at it than Alabama because within Ohio State's 75-yard drives, a lot of them are 7, 8, 9 plays, and Alabama's done some of that, but a lot of theirs are like 2, 3 plays, and that's even worse. When you go 3 and out or you score in 2 or 3 plays, because what that says is you're relying on a lot of low percentage stuff. And so I think Ohio State is better in that regard, but I think offenses in general are struggling with that. And then on the flip side, you've got offenses like Vanderbilt's and, funnily enough, 2 weeks in a row for Alabama, South Carolina, and to an extent Kentucky. These are SEC offenses, but, same thing with Iowa and Iowa State. You've got these teams that can dramatically neutralize talent gaps because they've decided offensively, we're going to exploit the clock rules, we're going to win the middle 8, and we're going to melt the clock and limit you to 9, 10 possessions instead of 12, 13 possessions. Because over the course of time, if you give the better team more possessions, the goodness is going to show and they're going to eventually take over. And with these clock rules and the ability to really sort of limit what the other team can do offensively, it's been a great neutralizer in a way that isn't so much, like you said, isn't so much parity as it is increased volatility. And it also makes a team who's, Vanderbilt, for example, they're not going to win a national championship, but because they can do offense this way and because they can exploit the modern game and the clock rules this way, instead of being the 90th best team in the country, they might be the 40th best team in the country. So for that standpoint, I think it's pretty interesting. Josh, you and I differ dramatically from the AP poll on one team, and that team is Penn State. And to me, like looking at Penn State, I got into it with Penn State fans this weekend. Apparently a guy who his entire career has been a 6 to 7 yard per attempt kind of guy has dramatically improved and is a completely different player this year because he blew up Kent State, Bowling Green. Let's take the one team in the top 80 who has a defense in the top 80 off the board because he only threw for 6.5 yards an attempt against Illinois. I have some struggles with Penn State because they're undefeated right now. And they could lose to Ohio State and go 11-1 and only play one ranked team this year and only play one maybe top 40 team this year. Illinois still ranked, even though they went to OT with a Purdue team that has lost like 66-0 in Notre Dame. My concern is, okay, if you don't play anybody, again, not your fault, then I have to go deeper than wins and losses. And right now, UCLA 27-11 was an ugly win. Illinois 21-7 was an ugly win. Had to fight for their life to come back against a USC team that just lost to Minnesota. One score win over Bowling Green. To me, they're in the Miami sort of realm of you haven't played anybody and you're barely beating more than half the teams you've played. So, sorry, they're going to get at me on that. 21-7 isn't barely beating Illinois, but when you score 14 offensive points against a team that just gave up 49, I think it was, to Purdue, that's not a great day. So for me, I'm having to judge Penn State on, yes, you're undefeated. You get credit for that. You're in the top 10, even though you're not really playing like a top 10 team. But on the flip side, I'm going to look at this USC game and not be super excited in a way that would have me put you third or fourth like the AP wants to do.
If you look at ESPN's FBI, which we have criticisms about certain parts of FBI, but as an overall ranking, it's decently good. It has one of the best mean error results of any model, meaning average ability to predict the exact score of a game. Penn State's 9th, USC's 13th, LSU's 14th. They have Miami at 10. They have Clemson at 11. FPI actually has Oregon at 8, Tennessee 7, Notre Dame 6, Ole Miss 5, Georgia 4, Alabama 3, Ohio State 2, Texas 1. Okay, just ain't rounding it out. That ranking for Penn State to me makes a lot of sense in FPI. You know, they're 4 spots ahead of USC. USC's 1 spot ahead of LSU. That was a close game with USC. They very easily could have lost. USC barely beat LSU. The team I don't get in FPI right now is Ole Miss. Just don't understand why they're as high as they are. They have not. They're a 2-loss team. I'm not. This is where I get critical of the computers. I don't understand why they're as high as they are. My big factoid for Ole Miss, by the way, quick aside, and I've said this on Twitter a number of times because I think it's fascinating. Lane Kiffin has never gone 8-4 or better in back-to-back years in his entire career. In 12 years, he didn't do it at USC. He didn't do it at Tennessee. He didn't do it at FAU. He's not done it at Ole Miss. So he's done it 4 times. He's gone like 8-4 or better, like 10-2. Every single time he lost 5 or more games the year after. And I don't know that they're going to lose 5 games given the schedule, but we're kind of seeing that from Ole Miss. They have issues with consistency under Kiffin. I think it's a little bit of he coaches scheme. He doesn't coach players and development as much from the focus. But beyond that, I mean, the Penn State discussion, you know, I think they're a little bit better than USC. I think they're a little bit better than LSU. And how much credit can I give you for being 6-0 given that schedule? Because, as I said, when we do this ranking, we say, here's how you did with your schedule. Here's how they did it their schedule. What would happen if you slop? Do you think they would go undefeated with Alabama's schedule playing Georgia? Do you think they would go undefeated with Georgia's schedule playing Alabama, with Oregon's schedule playing Ohio State's schedule playing Oregon, Clemson's schedule playing Georgia? My answer to all that is no, Daniel. So it's, you know, the way I look at it, you know, I refuse to buy the argument that just because you're undefeated, you have to be at the top, because teams don't play wildly similar schedules. And, you know, 7-point win over Bowling Green, a 3-point win over USC, you know, 16-point win, which I know they were mostly in control over UCLA. Those things are not doing it for me. Even, you know, the West Virginia win was something of a statement win at 34-12, but West Virginia is not a particularly good team. They were tied 7-0 with Illinois at the half. And Illinois barely beat Purdue over the weekend. I don't think that they should, you know, I think they really shouldn't be a ranked team. I don't think they will end a ranked team. They play Michigan, Oregon to round out the year, and I think they're going to drop another one like Minnesota or something. So I'm with you. I mean, I still have Penn State in my top 10, and I know we're kind of dunking on them a lot right now, but we're dunking in the sense to justify why we have them where we have them. And it just is, it's schedule and results versus schedule. It's just so much weaker than the competition. I don't know what to do with it. And while I'm sitting here saying this again, we'll, you know, look up FBI strength of schedule. You know, I mentioned it for Texas that they were, you know, in the 80s, but with 9th as things continue. I mean, Penn State's at 50th. Remaining strength of schedules 24th. You know,
and that's solely because of Ohio State.
Yeah, 50th still isn't great. If you look at teams ahead of them, they're about the same strength of schedule as Tennessee, as Notre Dame. So I can see the argument why they should be ranked ahead of them. Those teams, sure. But Georgia's strength of schedule is 7th. Alabama's 24th. Ohio State's 31st at this point. Ole Miss's is 41st. So, you know, it's tough. It's very tough to rank them.
And I think Penn State's schedule is the old Sagarin approach, really, where they don't have a ton of Kent State bad quality on their schedule, but they don't have a lot of, you know, teams that somebody's going to beat. I don't understand the AP's reasoning here. They shoot Oregon up to number 2, and then they drop Ohio State behind Penn State. I just don't know that, like, Ohio State lost that game probably because of a borderline offensive pass interference call in the last drive. That's probably why they lost. It was a coin flip game on the road. I just can't get there. And this is not to say that, like, I do think Penn State is a top 10 team because other teams have flaws. Because what Penn State fans are going to rightly turn around and say is, okay, we maybe wouldn't beat Georgia right now, but we wouldn't lose to Vanderbilt. And I agree with that. So I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag with them. And I do think Aller looked better yesterday than I've ever seen him look. And I don't think USC's defense is your typical Lincoln Riley coach defense. I don't think they're great, but I think they're better than anything he's performed well against in the past. So there are signs that he's improving, but Penn State right now at number 3 is just way too hot. And the problem with that is they're so high now with such a just crap schedule left to go. They can lose that Ohio State game and it still doesn't matter. They're going to moonwalk into the playoffs because there's just nobody on their schedule that's got a pulse, which, again, not their fault. And I do think they're a top 12 team that belongs in the playoffs at this point. All right, Josh, we got some other previews to do, so give me a parting shot on this week's action, and we'll go from there.
I think my parting shot on this week's action with a lot of teams is just the fact that it's becoming really obvious that football is reverting to where it was, I think, about 20 years ago, that everybody can win on any given Saturday. And I think we're talking a lot of it up to NIL and transfer portal, and I think in a way that's fair, because a team like Vandy can become a competitive team when they were not a competitive team. Colorado can become competitive when they weren't. But look, Vegas, I remember there was like the record for, I know it was at least 10 years, maybe 20 years or more, most games with a spread within 7 points this past weekend. I remember seeing that stat floating around. And, quick aside, people prayed for my family about a situation. I'll add we actually had an immediate family member pass away over the weekend. So things were a little chaotic, but I watched as much as I could. I thankfully had some time to rest on Saturday. I think that the nature of the game has changed. I think we had a period from about 2012 to about 2022 where a combination of the hurry up, no huddle and the RPO meant if you had dominant players at the receiver position and especially the running back and quarterback position to supplement that, you got so many runaway scores from elite talent teams that beating those teams was just nigh impossible. And the predictability of the sport went way, way up. Like, the playoffs were the same teams every year. People blamed the playoffs, they blamed all kinds of things. I think it was the nature of the sport. Nick Saban's, is this what you want football to be? I don't think people understood that the way we decided we wanted football to be was we created a game that Alabama could win every year just on recruiting. And we've seen defenses catch up, do some things to balance that out. They're taking away the RPOs. Teams like Tennessee can get shut down clearly now, and we'll talk about that game. We're going to have a preview for Alabama and Tennessee. We'll have another preview of Texas and Georgia this week. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of is parity in terms of volatility, because now whether you tackle, whether you have turnovers, how well you manage the clock, those things that used to win old school football win now. And what's really fascinating to me, Daniel, is styles of football that used to win years ago are starting to win again. Vanderbilt and now South Carolina with Sorrell, they're using a lot of veer option concepts and these new style defenses that are like zone confusion for the quarterback that move around a lot. They don't do well playing assignment football versus teams that smash you in the mouth. And these talent equalization schemes that used to be good 40 years ago are suddenly really effective. And it's just funny how it's all cyclical, but a thing, I think what we're really seeing more even than NIL and transfer portal is that cycle's turned back to anybody can win on every Saturday because it's how well you execute. And the teams that execute well down the stretch, the teams that gel as a team, those are going to be the dominant teams. And I think we will see more predictability because I think we'll see some of these really high talent teams, Daniel, coalesce and execute at a higher level when they gel. And a lot of that's transfers, having new people and schemes, but they're going to start executing their systems better. And the teams that do, those teams are going to have the decided advantage more so than just pure talent like we'd seen a few years ago. And to me, that's a very, very healthy thing for the sport of college football.
All right, y'all, give us your top 10 in the comments. Let us know your thoughts on what you do with a team like Ohio State that goes on the road, loses in a last-second game, somewhat potentially because of officiating. What do you do with them Love to see it. All right, y'all. Thanks so much. Have a great week. God bless.